The Polish-Ukrainian War of 1918 and 1919 was a conflict between the forces of the Second Polish Republic and West Ukrainian People's Republic for the control over Eastern Galicia after the dissolution of Austria-Hungary. Background. The origins of the conflict lie in the complex nationality situation in Galicia at the turn of the 20th century. As a result of its relative leniency toward national minorities, the House of Habsburg was the perfect ground for the development of both Polish and Ukrainian national movements. During the 1848 revolution, the Austrians, concerned by Polish demands for greater autonomy within the province, gave support to a small group of Ruthenians whose goal was to be recognized as a distinct nationality. After that, Ruthenian language schools were established, Ruthenian political parties formed, and the Ruthenians began attempts to develop their national culture. This came as a surprise to Poles, who until the revolution believed, along with most of the politically aware Ruthenians, that Ruthenians were part of the Polish nation. In the late 1890s and the first decades of the next century, the populist Ruthenian intelligentsia adopted the term Ukrainians to describe their nationality. Beginning with the 20th century, national consciousness reached a large number of Ruthenian peasants. Multiple incidents between the two nations occurred throughout the latter 19th century and early 20th century. For example, in 1897 the Polish administration opposed the Ukrainians in parliamentary elections. Another conflict developed in the years 1901 to 1908 around Lviv University, where Ukrainian students demanded a separate Ukrainian university, while Polish students and faculty attempted to suppress the movement. In 1903 both Poles and Ukrainians held separate conferences in Lviv. Afterwards, the two national movements developed with contradictory goals, leading towards the later clash. The ethnic composition of Galicia underlay the conflict between the Poles and Ukrainians there. The Austrian province of Galicia consisted of territory seized from Poland in 1772, during the First Partition. This land, which included territory of historical importance to Poland, including the ancient capital of Kraków, had a majority Polish population. Although the eastern part of Galicia included the heartland of the historic territory of Galicia Volhynia and had a Ukrainian majority. In eastern Galicia, Ukrainians made up approximately 65% of the population while Poles made up only 22% of the population. Of the 44 administrative divisions of Austrian Eastern Galicia, Lviv, the biggest and capital city of the province, was the only one in which Poles made up a majority of the population. In Lviv, the population in 1910 was approximately 60% Polish and 17% Ukrainian. This city with its Polish inhabitants was considered by many Poles to have been one of Poland's cultural capitals. For many Poles, including Lviv's Polish population, it was unthinkable that their city should not be under Polish control. The religious and ethnic divisions corresponded to social stratification. Galicia's leading social class were Polish nobles or descendants of Rus gentry who had become Polonized in the past, whereas, in the eastern part of the province Ruthenians constituted the majority of the peasant population. Poles and Jews were responsible for most of the commercial and industrial development in Galicia in the late 19th century. Throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries the local Ukrainians attempted to persuade the Austrians to divide Galicia into western and eastern provinces. These efforts were resisted and thwarted by those local Poles who feared losing control of Lviv and East Galicia. The Austrians eventually agreed in principle to divide the province of Galicia. In October 1916 the Austrian Emperor Karl I promised to do so once the war had ended. Prelude. Due to the intervention of Archduke Wilhelm of Austria, who adopted a Ukrainian identity and considered himself a Ukrainian patriot, in October 1918 two regiments of mostly Ukrainian troops were garrisoned in Lemberg. As the Austro-Hungarian government collapsed, on October 18, 1918, the Ukrainian National Council, consisting of Ukrainian members of the Austrian Parliament and regional Galician and Bukovinan Diets as well as leaders of Ukrainian political parties, was formed. The council announced the intention to unite the West Ukrainian lands into a single state, as the Poles were taking their own steps to take over Lviv and Eastern Galicia. Captain Dmytro Vitovsky of the 6th Riflemen led the group of young Ukrainian officers in a decisive action, and during the night of October 31, November 1, the Ukrainian military units took control over Lviv. The West Ukrainian People's Republic was proclaimed on November 1, 1918, with Lviv as its capital. The timing of proclamation of the Republic caught the Polish ethnic population and administration by surprise. The new Ukrainian Republic claimed sovereignty over Eastern Galicia, including the Carpathians up to the city of Nowy Sącz in the west, as well as Volhynia, Carpathian Ruthenia and Bukovina, while many of the Polish soldiers, particularly from what had been Congress Poland, wanted to return home because they saw no reason to fight against Ruthenians over Ruthenian lands. The Polish forces were outnumbered by 2-1, and lacked ammunition. Despite being initially outnumbered, the Poles had certain advantages. Their forces had many more and better trained officers, resulting in a better discipline and more mobile force. The Poles also enjoyed excellent intelligence and, due to their control of railroads behind their lines, were able to move their soldiers quite quickly. As a result, although the Poles had fewer total troops than did the Ukrainians, in particularly important battles they were able to bring in as many soldiers as did the Ukrainians. On December 9, 1918, Ukrainian forces broke through the outer defences of Przemysl in the hope of capturing the city and thus cutting off Polish-controlled Lviv from central Poland. However, the Poles were able to quickly send relief troops, and by December 17, the Ukrainians were forced back. On December 27, bolstered by peasant troops sent to Galicia from eastern Ukraine in the hopes that the western Ukrainians would be able to form a disciplined force out of them, a general Ukrainian offensive against Lviv began. Lviv's defences held, and the eastern Ukrainian troops mutinied. From January 6 to January 11, 1919, a Polish attack by 5,000 newly recruited forces from formerly Russian Poland commanded by Jan Roma was repulsed by Western Ukrainian forces near Rava Ruska, north of Lviv. Only a small number of troops together with Roma were able to break through to Lviv after suffering heavy losses. Between January 11 and January 13, Polish forces attempted to dislodge Ukrainian troops besieging Lviv from the south, while at the same time Ukrainian troops attempted another general assault on Lviv. Both efforts failed. In February 1919, Polish troops attempting to capture Sambor were defeated by the Ukrainian defenders with heavy losses, although the poor mobility of the Ukrainian troops prevented them from taking advantage of this victory. On February 14, Ukrainian forces began another assault on Lviv. By February 20, they were able to successfully cut off the rail links between Lviv and Przemysl, leaving Lviv surrounded and the Ukrainian forces in a good position to take the city. However, a French-led mission from the Entente arrived at the Ukrainian headquarters in February 22 and demanded that the Ukrainians cease hostilities under threat of breaking all diplomatic ties between the Entente and the Ukrainian government. On February 25, the Ukrainian military suspended its offensive. The Barthélemy mission proposed a demarcation line leaving almost 70% of the East Galician territory to Ukrainians, and Lviv with oil fields to Poland. The Ukrainians would be supplied with half of the oil production. The proposal was accepted by the Poles. The Allied demands, which included the loss of significant amount of Ukrainian held and inhabited territory, were however deemed to excessively favor the Poles by the Ukrainians, who resumed their offensive on March 4. On March 5, Ukrainian artillery blew up the Polish forces' ammunition dump in Lviv. The resultant explosion caused a panic among Polish forces. The Ukrainians, however, failed to take advantage of this. During the time of the ceasefire, the Poles had been able to organize a relief force of 8,000–10,000 troops which by March 12 reached Przemysl and by March 18 had driven the Ukrainian forces from the Lviv-Przemysl railroad, permanently securing Lviv. On January 6 to 11 of 1919, a small part of the Ukrainian Galician army invaded Transcarpathia to spread pro-Ukrainian sentiments among residents. Ukrainian troops fought with Czechoslovak and Hungarian local police. They succeeded in capturing some Hungarian-controlled Ukrainian settlements. After some clashes with Czechoslovaks, the Ukrainians retreated because Czechoslovakia was the only country that traded with the Western Ukrainian People's Republic and that supported it politically. Further conflict with the Czechoslovak authorities would have led to the complete economical and political isolation of the Western Ukrainian People's Republic. Ukrainian collapse. A Polish general offensive throughout Volhynia and Eastern Galicia began on May 14, 1919. It was carried out by units of the Polish army aided by the newly arrived Blue Army of General Joseph Hallenberg. This army, composed of Polish forces which had fought for the Entente on the Western Front, numbering 60,000 troops, was well equipped by the Western Allies and partially staffed with experienced French officers specifically in order to fight the Bolsheviks and not the forces of the Western Ukrainian People's Republic. Despite this, the Poles dispatched Haller's army against the Ukrainians in order to break the stalemate in Eastern Galicia. The Allies sent several telegrams ordering the Poles to halt their offensive as using of the French-equipped army against the Ukrainians specifically contradicted the conditions of the French help. But these were ignored, with Poles claiming that all Ukrainians were Bolsheviks. At the same time, on May 23, Romania opened a second front against Ukrainian forces, demanding their withdrawal from the southern sections of Eastern Galicia, including from the temporary capital of Stanislaviv. This resulted in a loss of territory, ammunition and further isolation from the outside world. The Ukrainian lines were broken, mostly due to the withdrawal of the elite Sikh riflemen. On May 27, the Polish forces reached the Zlota Lipa Berezhany Jazirna Radziwiłło line. The Polish advance was accompanied by a large wave of anti-Jewish violence and looting conducted not only by disorganized Polish mobs, as in Lviv in 1918, but by Polish military units operating against the orders of their officers, in particular those of the Poznan regiments and Haller's army. Following the demands of the Entente, the Polish offensive was halted and the troops of General Haller adopted defensive positions. Chortków offensive and ultimate Polish victory. On June 8, 1919, the Ukrainian forces under the new command of Oleksandr Rykov, a former general in the Russian army, started a counter-offensive, and after 3 weeks advanced to Hyla Lipa and the upper Stryja River, defeating 5 Polish divisions. Although the Polish forces had been forced to withdraw, they were able to prevent their forces from collapsing and avoided being encircled and captured. Thus, in spite of their victories, the Ukrainian forces were unable to obtain significant amounts of arms and ammunition. By June 27, the Ukrainian forces had advanced 120 kilometers along the Dniester River, and on another they had advanced 150 kilometers past the town of Brody. They came to within 2 days' march of Lviv. The successful Chortkov offensive halted primarily because of a lack of arms. There were only 5 to 10 bullets for each Ukrainian soldier. The West Ukrainian government controlled the Drohobych oil fields with which it planned to purchase arms for the struggle. But for political and diplomatic reasons, weapons and ammunition could only be sent to Ukraine through Czechoslovakia. Although the Ukrainian forces managed to push the Poles back approximately 120 to 150 kilometers, they failed to secure a route to Czechoslovakia. This meant that they were unable to replenish their supply of arms and ammunition, and the resulting lack of supplies forced Rykov to end his campaign. Joseph Pilsudski assumed the command of the Polish forces on June 27 and started yet another offensive, helped by 2 fresh Polish divisions. On June 28, the Polish offensive began. Short of ammunition and facing an enemy now twice its size, the Ukrainians were pushed back to the line of the river Zbruch by mid-July 1919. Although the Ukrainian infantry had run out of ammunition, its artillery had not. This provided the Ukrainian forces with cover for an orderly retreat. Approximately 100,000 civilian refugees and 60,000 troops, 20,000 of whom were combat-ready, were able to escape across the Zbruch River into eastern Ukraine.